Hi, and welcome to video 4. This is for our emotions and self-disclosure module. And at this point, you should start to see some repetition of different ideas. But this model is really about the role that emotions play in communication, and also how emotions are a kind of communication and they are an effect of communication. They're not kind of this other thing. Also, there's no such thing as emotional communication and then like rational communication. All communication has an emotional component. There are just different types of emotions. So what you may be calling like you're being emotional when we're arguing is really just that they're expressing certain kinds of emotion when they communicate that you might be identifying as frustration or anger or sadness. And they may be sort of at a higher amplification. So what you'll notice, you have the feelings worksheet, and it talks about the 3 different sort of levels of feelings: the high intensity, moderate intensity, and low intensity. And often when we're saying that some communication feels more emotional, it's because the intensity of that communication is much higher than the low intensity communication that maybe I'm experiencing. So we might both be experiencing frustration, but my frustration may be more like annoyance, and your frustration may be more like full-blown anger. And so it's important that you sort of get rid of that binary between emotional and rational, and just recognize that all communication has an emotional component. People just communicate with different intensities and types of emotion, and that one of the most important things you can do as a communicator is be very purposeful about the emotional component, the emotional content that you want to transmit when you are communicating. And again, some of it has to do with what the other person perceives, but certainly you can expand your skill set so that when you are communicating, you're being more purposeful about the emotional tone that you use, and also how to think about the way that emotions might be helpful or harmful to you in your own intra and interpersonal communication, and taking control of that, right? And both of these are what we call emotional intelligence. And you'll learn more about emotional intelligence in Maddie's video, but essentially we have this concept of like IQ, right? Intelligence, intellectual quotient, I think is what IQ stands for. And your emotional intelligence, or your EQ, is your ability to use emotions productively, to engage in thoughtful emotional communication, to manage your emotions, and to recognize that all communication is emotional. It's just typically it doesn't have as intense of a valence, right? So for example, my communication right now is emotional. I would say it's sort of maybe compared to other people, I might be like at a moderate state of intensity right now, but compared to some people, I'm probably even at a low intensity state. So I tend to be sort of a higher intensity emotion person. So maybe at a high level right now, we would call what I'm doing passionate. Maybe at a moderate level, we would call what I'm doing invested, right? And then maybe at a very low level, we might call it curiosity. So I'm sort of at a mid level, I would say right now. Although to some of you, again, depending on your sort of emotional tolerance, I might feel very high, I might feel very intense. And for other people, this might feel very, very low intensity, but I would never call this non-emotional, right? I wouldn't call what I'm doing rational right now. Again, one emotion you might experience is joy or pleasure. I would say that right now I'm experiencing something in the happiness joy range because I'm enjoying what I'm doing and I'm in a very comfortable setting and this is pleasurable to me. But I wouldn't say I'm have like full-blown ecstasy, right? That wouldn't be what we would describe this as, but maybe content or pleasant, which are more like low to maybe medium emotional intensities. And the more you practice labeling things as different types of emotions, different categories of emotion, different intensities, the more you get out of that binary between, oh, well, I'm being emotional and you're being rational. Now, you can say to people, the emotion that you're putting out right now that I'm perceiving and the intensity are just, I'm not responding well to those. Or you can use your I statements to say, I'm feeling a lot of anger, I'm feeling a lot of resentment, and I just don't function well with those kinds of feelings. So if, maybe if we could take a break or if you could switch tenors, I'd be able to interact with you better. Those are all perfectly fair things to say, but this whole like, you need to be rational when you communicate with me is not fair or accurate. And same way, if people say that to you, it's often gendered, it's often raced. You're welcome to say, I'm not being irrational, right? I'm communicating with emotion. You're also communicating with emotion, right? Apathy, disinvestment, not sarcasm's not an emotion, but condescension. Those can all be types of emotion. So expanding your emotional vocabulary is going to be important for doing the kind of work that we're practicing in this particular unit. Hold on real quick. I'm just going to check and make sure that my video is my face still in it? Yeah, good. Okay. All right. So with that said, what is an emotion? So a lot of us think of an emotion as a biological response that kind of shoots us like a lightning bolt. It happens very automatically. And to some degree that is true, right? Emotions are learned very early on. In fact, I'm reading this book right now called The Ascent of Affect. Affect is another word for emotion. So essentially emotion is like coded affect, and affect is just the name of the intensity in your body that you feel physiologically in response to stimuli. And what they're showing is that a lot of this research that we have on emotions and like how there are 8 emotions and there are primary emotions and they're a blend and people can recognize them and pride looks like this and smiling, it's all wrong, right? It's all based on very faulty research. And then in fact, we have a very poor sense of how emotional communication works, which is kind of cool for me because instead of teaching you what other people teach, I can teach you whatever I think is true because at this point, it's all pretty much a guessing game. So the definition of an emotion is a thought feeling. Thought feeling, right? Thought dash feeling. And what that means is that it is something you feel, right? It's a response to a stimuli. It's a vibration in your body. It might feel flushed. It might feel warm. You might feel cold. You might kind of feel like, like you've been like mildly electrocuted, like you got to get out of there, right? Typically when you're feeling an emotion, you have some kind of vibration. It might be very subtle, and for a lot of us, we've had it so many times or we've experienced the same pattern so often that we don't even notice that we're having it. And many times we don't even know we had an emotion until later when sort of the emotion leaves our body, and suddenly we realize that we'd experienced a lot of joy and now that's kind of flooded out and now we're recovering from that, right? So an emotion is part feeling because you feel it, right? It's also part thought though, because emotions come from your thoughts. That means a couple things. One, it means that every emotion is a communicative act. It might be intrapersonal communication, but it is communicative. It is not like a lightning bolt striking you from nowhere. 2, emotions are in response to things that you think, which means that they are changeable because once you have a thought, you may not be in control of how that thought translates to an emotion. So if you have the thought, I was supposed to get that job, for example, like that was my job. I was promised that job and they gave it to that other person. You may feel angry because the definition of anger, and I like this definition. I think this definition is important. The definition of anger is the perception of a blocked, entitled outcome. So if you perceive that you wanted something really badly, like I wanted the job, but it was never really mine, right? We all had to apply and I was never guaranteed the job. And then somebody else takes it or somebody else gets the job, right? You may feel disappointment. You might feel sadness. You might feel upset with yourself. You may feel guilt, right? You might feel a bunch of things, but you're not going to feel anger because, well, how can you be angry? It was never really my job. Nobody took it away from me. Nobody gave it to someone else when it was supposed to be mine. It just happened, right? So disappointment in that case would be a better explanation than anger. But if you think they promised me that job, they implied that I would get it, I deserve that job, I've worked here forever, it was supposed to be mine, then somebody takes it or they gave it away or they took it from you and gave it to them, you're going to feel angry because anger is it's an emotion in response to the perception or the thought that something that was supposed to be yours, right? So entitled, you were entitled to it, you owned it, it was yours, has been blocked or taken by an external agent, right? And a good place to think of this is with kids, right? So you can see how you'd have a very different emotional response if your kid is doing something like you want the kid to go to bed at 8 o'clock or whatever. So you're like, hey, you got to go to bed. And the kid's like, no. One thought could be, oh, they're a kid. They like staying up late. Obviously, they don't want to go to bed. And it's my job to get them into bed, but they're not doing this on purpose. It's just how they feel. It's a natural kid thing to not want to go to sleep. You're not going to feel angry. You might feel frustrated. You might feel disappointed because maybe you thought the kid was going to go to bed and they didn't, and now you might feel some loss. You might feel forlorn. You might feel just sort of like a sadness because you're not a very good parent. I mean, whatever. Any of that stuff could happen, but you're not going to feel angry. Whereas if you think to yourself, you're doing this on purpose, you know better, you know you're supposed to be in bed and you're saying this just to make me upset, right? You do this just to threaten my authority. If you have those kinds of feelings, like you were entitled for the kid to want to go to bed at 8 and the kid doesn't, right? That belonged to you and they took it away. you're going to feel angry because your goals are being blocked. So it's important to understand what anger is, because for most of us, anger is a very unproductive emotion on an individual interpersonal level. Now, at a collective level, anger can be very productive because, for example, if you're part of a union and your union feels entitled to a living wage, which people are, right? And this is where it gets tricky because, like, what are people entitled to? Well, that's a thought. So you have to be careful about, but I think people are entitled to a living wage, right? A wage where you can pay your rent, pay your expenses, healthcare. I think people are entitled to healthcare. I mean, that's my perception. So if an employer won't give those things to people, if they're cutting wages or they're keeping people at 39 hours so they can't get overtime, maybe anger is a productive emotion because you feel like that thing should be yours and you want to fight on behalf of it. But in the examples I just gave about, parenting or the job, it may not necessarily be a productive emotion. Of course, if the job was in fact yours, right? If your employer had promised you the job and you had a verbal contract and then they took it away from you and gave it to someone maybe for a gendered or raced reason or because they're younger, I mean, any of those reasons, then anger might be a productive emotion, but you have to think really hard, was I actually entitled to this? And that's where things get tricky. And of course, I'm sure you know someone who feels very entitled to things and gets very angry when they don't get it, but of course, they were never entitled to that stuff. So anger is the perception of blocked goals. All right. So you may feel angry, but anger still comes from a series of thoughts, right? It doesn't just strike you like lightning and you can't do anything about it. That's why to manage your emotions, yes, you need to manage the physical symptoms of your emotions. So things like exercising, taking a walk, deep breathing, right? That's all good. But from a communication perspective, the key to emotional management is thought management, because kind of like once you've had the thought and the thought has ginned up all of these emotional physical responses, at that point, the battle's a lot harder to win because you kind of have to let the adrenaline and all of the physiological changes that go along with it kind of escape from your system. So part of what you're trying to intercept is this: I have thought, right? And usually your thoughts are rehearsed. I have a physiological response, and then I have to work out the physiological response. Instead, I have thought. I immediately see that thought is not a productive thought. I want to change it to this other thought, and then I don't have as much physiological energy that I have to work out. So thought management is going to be really important to feeling or emotion management. And that's why I define emotions as thought feelings, because they're not just feelings that strike like lightning out of nowhere. And they're also not just thoughts because you do have a physical response in your body. So an emotion is a thought feeling. Now, basically the rest of the unit is you learning about how to manage emotions, different things that may be affecting your emotions, right? Some of the trends that we have socially around emotion. And one thing I want to talk about that I think is important is this idea of happiness, because the emotion that we all want to feel is happiness, right? And let's say if happiness is too intense for you, maybe you just want to feel content, meaning you want to feel problem-free, right? You don't want to feel worry, you don't want to feel stress. So for most of us, that's what we consider good emotions, right? Good emotions mean I'm happy, I'm content. But I think it's really important, and this is why I signed that reading by Mark Manson about happiness, that you understand that happiness does not come from a lack of problems. Happiness comes from solving problems. So if you don't have any problems right now, you're less likely to experience happiness than you are to experience apathy, lethargy, self-doubt, right? You tend to gin up those kinds of problems. And that's why when you meet someone who's never sort of like had a lot of struggle or had a lot to go through, they tend to be sort of a very like entitled, superficial, boring kind of person because they haven't really developed a lot of resilience, right? So for those of you who kind of come to this unit with this mindset that like, I just want to be happy, meaning I don't want to have all my problems that I have, I want to go away. You may not want the problems you currently have, right? If you can't pay your mortgage, if your kid is getting in a lot of trouble, if you aren't passing your classes, right? Those are problems you don't want to have. But to say that you want to solve those problems and replace them with other problems is what you mean. You don't mean, I want my problems to go away, because then you would just be living in a vacuum where you got everything you want. So when Mark Manson talks about happiness, kind of like coming from solving problems, right? That your brain releases endorphins from solving problems. It's fundamentally and absolutely true. And it may not feel good. You may not like that definition. You may not like the argument that the way to achieve sort of a more emotionally pleasant life is to have a lot of solved problems. But in fact, for most of us, I think it rings true with our life. And again, I'm not a biologist. I don't know if biologically it's true, but when I think about how I want to think about the world and how it makes sense to me based on the research that I know as a communication professor, it makes sense to me that solving a problem brings more happiness. And the reason we know this is because they've done studies about money, right? So money it solves a lot of problems for most of us. We have more money, we have fewer problems. And they've done many studies. And I think, again, I'm not a social scientist, so I don't know if the studies are perfect, but they make sense. So up to a certain point, and I think it's somewhere around $80,000 or $100,000, people's happiness increases with the amount of money they make, right? And the amount of money that they get. And again, I don't know how the social scientist is defining happiness. So, but let's just say right now you make $40,000 and you have a lot of problems, right? $40,000 isn't going to stretch very far, especially if you're supporting a family and you have debt. But let's suppose I increase it to $100,000. You're probably going to feel a fair amount of happiness, right? But then what they find is that after $100,000, the happiness kind of trails off because the stuff you're buying above $100,000 is not really doing you a whole lot of good. And then pretty shortly after that, as the money starts to climb into the 150s, happiness actually decreases. So this idea that money can't buy happiness isn't exactly true because it can to a point. The upper middle class is pretty happy, but anything beyond that actually can't buy happiness. And that's because after a certain point, you're not really solving problems, right? You're buying a lot of things, you're going on a lot of vacations, you're getting a lot of stuff, you're doing a lot of experiences. You don't have as much you have to do. You might be able to hire a housekeeper, you get to send your kids to the best colleges, whatever. But at a certain point, you have no more problems to solve. And they find, in fact, that people who are wealthy and happy, which is rare, but people who are making several $100,000 a year or more, they are people who are constantly solving problems, right? So they are people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates who are huge tech entrepreneurs, and they're inventing and they're creating because they can continue to get happy because they continue to solve problems. The money doesn't make them complacent. So happiness does not solve problems, happiness comes from solving problems. And so you kind of have to go into that with this mindset because it matters for your interpersonal relationships. Because if you're having bad interpersonal relationships, right, you and your boss don't get along very well, you and your sister are fighting, whatever, and you think the key to this problem is just to be happy, right? You want this problem with your sister or your husband or your whatever to go away. That isn't actually what's going to happen. What you want is a better problem. So this is a mindset you want to take to your interpersonal relationships because it really changes your energy. Instead of saying, with my students, I don't want to have no problems with my students, right? That would just mean that basically they all hand in perfect papers. I never have to teach. Everything's, I would really, would be learning, right? Because learning is a kind of problem solving. You learn by solving problems. And so when I create a new course pack or when I make a new video or when I up the quality of the study guide or I write a new test, yes, I'm irritated at those moments that I have to be doing those things, but I'm also solving problems, and they're good problems that I'm solving, right? Creating better materials, increasing the learning quality. Those are good problems to have. So I guess we really shouldn't say happiness comes from solving problems. What we should say is happiness comes from solving problems that feel like they have purpose or meaning. Because some problems, like making sure my kid gets fed, is probably not going to create happiness. So again, some of this is Mark Manson is he's a middle upper class straight cis white male, right? So his understanding of problems in the world are probably pretty narrow. And if you read the whole book, he's got this whole thing about how he used to live on somebody's couch and he wanted to be an entrepreneur, but he couldn't make it happen. And it's well, that's not real. That is suffering. It's kind of lame suffering because he didn't have a lot of self-efficacy, but I wouldn't call it the kinds of problems that the majority of people face. So I don't want this to seem like an elitist unit. And one of the things that's important to know about this unit is that this is an individualized unit. So when we talk about thought management and resilience and using your thoughts to overcome problems and create new thoughts and create new feelings for yourself, we're talking about this on a very individual level. We're also making many assumptions. We're making the assumptions that your brain chemistry is in order. We're making the assumptions that you don't suffer from crippling depression. We're making assumptions that you're not part of a historically minoritized group, right? We're making assumptions about the fact you get enough to eat and you're hydrated and that you get enough sleep at night and that you know where your next meal is coming from. All of these things are presumptions because certainly at a point, especially at the collective level, the kinds of strategies that we're recommending in this unit just are not going to work. So I really like this as an interpersonal unit and for your own thought management. I know that it helps people, and I know that even people suffering from depression or who, despite being part of a historically minoritized group, have to sort of get through their day and pick themselves up, thought management is a really good strategy to have. But it's also very, very privileged to assume that anybody can just do this. It's really, I think, also not true that groups can do this. So when we talk about like indigenous people who live all across the United States and are kind of living in some of the worst living conditions, or the true poor, right? The American poor who are living under $14,000 a day. To say that like they just need to learn thought management is, I think, crass. Maybe at an individual level, certainly thought management can help, but at a group level, it just doesn't translate because groups need different things, right? Big groups than an individual group. So just because in this unit I'm recommending on an individual level that you should think about thought management as a way to improve your interpersonal relationships and to improve your relationship to yourself, it does not translate at the group level that just means like, oh, every woman in America who's experienced sexual trauma should just practice thought management and work on their emotional intelligence, right? Or every soldier coming back from war with PTSD or minor PTSD or any, right, of the things that happen when you experience wartime deployment, they should just practice thought management. It also doesn't necessarily mean people aren't responsible for their thoughts, but again, at the group level, groups need different things than individuals need, right? And sometimes they're the same and a lot of times they're not. So take this with a warning that this unit, right, is about interpersonal relationships from like one to one or one to a few. It is not a group dynamics course. I would never teach resilience as a group dynamic because I think at a group level, people need structural changes, right? Thought management only works one-on-one individually. It does not work at the group level. All right, and I think that's pretty much everything. So we've covered the definition of emotion, thought, feeling. Talked about resilience as sort of like the payoff of being thoughtfully mindful and managing your thoughts and emotions, but how it doesn't translate at a group level. Happiness comes from solving problems. That's right. And again, solving problems that feel like they have meaning and purpose, not maybe solving like basic life skill problems, getting food, getting water, getting shelter. I don't know that you could be happy doing those things. And then the definition of anger, because this is an emotion that a lot of us experience. But again, we have to ask ourselves, like, were we entitled to that to begin with? And a lot of times, especially I think with interpersonal privileged kinds of problems, the answer is no. Technology is a great example, right? We get all angry that our tech doesn't work or somebody took our parking spot or whatever. And it's kind of like, really, you deserve the parking spot. I mean, it was yours, and some other jerk with a car and air conditioning outside the mall took your parking. It's really silly. So the more you kind of take that perspective that you were not really entitled to these things, they were always a luxury that just did not belong to you, the easier it is for you not to feel anger, which again, at an individual level, I don't know is productive. Although again, if this were a group dynamics course or a social change course, we might talk about how anger has kind of been very productive at the group level, right? All right, so that's all I have for Module 4. Enjoy Maddie's video. You're also going to have a podcast from the Life Coach School in this particular unit. And if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them in the YouTube feed, or you can always email me. Bye.